Welcome back to another chilling episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In the fall of 1982, Chicago residents began dying mysteriously after taking what should have been ordinary Tylenol capsules. What followed was an unprecedented wave of terror that would change American consumer safety forever. 7 innocent people lost their lives to a killer who turned medicine cabinets into murder weapons. The case sparked the largest pharmaceutical recall in history and revolutionized how we package medications today. Yet despite one of the most extensive investigations in FBI history, the person responsible has never been caught. This is the story of the Chicago Tylenol murders. In the fall of 1982, the city of Chicago and its surrounding suburbs would become the epicenter of one of the most notorious and frightening cases of product tampering in American history. It began on September 29, 1982, when 12-year-old Mary Kellerman of Elk Grove Village woke up feeling under the weather. Like countless other Americans that morning, she reached for what should have been a safe and reliable over-the-counter medication, extra-strength Tylenol. Her parents gave her 1 capsule to help with her symptoms. Within hours, Mary was dead. On that same devastating day, Adam Janus, a 27-year-old postal worker from Arlington Heights, took extra-strength Tylenol to combat chest pain. He collapsed shortly after and was pronounced dead at Northwest Community Hospital. In a cruel twist of fate, his brother Stanley and sister-in-law Teresa gathered at his house to mourn his sudden death. Both suffering from headaches brought on by their grief, they too took Tylenol from the same bottle that had been in Adam's home. Within 48 hours, 3 members of the same family were dead. The string of mysterious deaths continued. Mary McFarland, a 31-year-old from Elmhurst, took Tylenol at work and collapsed. Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant, was found dead in her Chicago apartment with an open bottle of extra-strength Tylenol nearby. Mary Reiner, a 27-year-old new mother from Winfield, became another victim after taking the medication to deal with postpartum pain. As bodies began to pile up, Dr. Edmund Donahue, Cook County's chief medical examiner, noticed a disturbing pattern. All of the victims had inexplicably died from cyanide poisoning. The connection between the deaths wasn't immediately apparent until Helen Jensen, a nurse from the Arlington Heights Fire Department, made a crucial observation. She remembered that Tylenol had been present at several of the death scenes. The investigation moved at lightning speed. On October 1, 1982, Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of McNeil Consumer Products, which manufactured Tylenol, was notified of the potential link. The response was unprecedented. The company immediately halted all production and advertising of Tylenol products and issued a nationwide recall of 31 million bottles, with a retail value of more than $100 million. Local officials raced against time to prevent more deaths. Chicago Mayor Jane Byrne issued a citywide warning and ordered emergency workers to drive through neighborhoods with bullhorns, warning residents not to take Tylenol. Police cars broadcasted warnings over their loudspeakers. The media played a crucial role, with local news stations interrupting regular programming to spread the alert. Laboratory analysis revealed the horrifying truth. Someone had been tampering with Tylenol capsules, removing the acetaminophen and replacing it with potassium cyanide. The amount of cyanide in each capsule was staggering, between 65 and 100 milligrams, enough to kill a person several times over. The poison was so potent that victims typically died within an hour of ingesting the tainted capsules. The investigation revealed that the perpetrator had somehow acquired bottles of extra-strength Tylenol, opened the capsules and laced them with cyanide, then carefully resealed the bottles and returned them to store shelves in various locations around Chicago. The killer had targeted pharmacies and stores in different areas, making the distribution seem random and unpredictable. The The FBI, Food and Drug Administration, and local law enforcement agencies launched one of the largest criminal investigations in American history. They discovered that the contaminated bottles came from different production lots, meaning they weren't tampered with during manufacturing. This pointed to someone accessing the bottles at the retail level, a realization that sent shockwaves through the pharmaceutical industry and American consumers alike. The case transformed how we think about product safety. Before the Chicago Tylenol murders, most medications and consumer products didn't have any tamper-resistant packaging. Bottles could be easily opened, their contents altered, and then returned to store shelves without anyone noticing. The murders exposed this vulnerability in devastating fashion. Johnson & Johnson's response to the crisis would later be studied in business schools as an example of excellent corporate crisis management. The company's chairman, James Burke, appeared on national television to warn consumers not to take any Tylenol products until further notice. The company's swift action and transparent communication, despite the massive financial cost, helped maintain public trust. As investigators dug deeper, they began looking into possible suspects. One early person of interest was James Lewis, who sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the killing. Lewis claimed he would continue to contaminate Tylenol bottles unless the money was paid. However, investigators later discovered that Lewis was in New York City during the killings, and while he was convicted of extortion, he was never charged with the murders themselves. The investigation also looked into Roger Arnold, a Chicago dock worker who had reportedly talked about poisoning people. Arnold was investigated but ultimately cleared of involvement in the Tylenol murders. He later shot and killed an innocent man he mistakenly believed had turned him into police for the Tylenol case, a tragic extension of the original crimes. As 1982 drew to a close, the Tylenol murders remained unsolved, but their impact was already being felt across the country. The case led to the rapid development of new tamper-resistant packaging. Within months, triple seal safety measures became the industry standard, including foil seals, sealed caps, and shrink-wrapped outer packaging. The Federal Anti-Tampering Act of 1983 made it a federal offense to tamper with consumer products. The murders also changed how companies approached crisis management. Johnson & Johnson's response, prioritizing public safety over profits, became a template for corporate responsibility. The company reintroduced Tylenol with new safety packaging and an aggressive marketing campaign to rebuild consumer confidence. Remarkably, Tylenol regained its market share within a year. The investigation into the Tylenol murders continued well into 1983, with law enforcement pursuing every possible lead. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile of the killer, suggesting they were likely a local person with knowledge of chemistry and possibly a grudge against either Johnson & Johnson or society at large. The profile indicated the perpetrator was probably male, methodical, and intelligent enough to understand both chemistry and distribution patterns. One of the most intriguing aspects of the investigation centered around the cyanide itself. Investigators determined that the poison used was potassium cyanide, a compound that wasn't readily available to the general public. This particular form of cyanide was primarily used in the jewelry and metal processing industries, which led investigators to explore connections to these fields. They discovered that several metal processing plants in the Chicago area used potassium cyanide, but tracking down every person with access to the chemical proved to be an enormous task. The investigation also revealed disturbing details about how the tampering had been carried out. The perpetrator had carefully opened the Tylenol capsules, which could be pulled apart to reveal the powder inside. After removing the acetaminophen, they had replaced it with cyanide and meticulously reassembled the capsules. The attention to detail was remarkable. The capsules looked completely normal to the naked eye. This level of precision suggested someone with steady hands and patience, possibly someone with experience in detailed manual work. By early 1983, investigators had conducted over 20,000 interviews and accumulated more than 400,000 pages of documents. They had followed up on countless tips and leads, many of which came from concerned citizens who thought they might have information about the crimes. The investigation became one of the most extensive and expensive in American history, involving multiple federal agencies, state police, and local law enforcement. James Lewis, though ruled out as the actual killer, remained an interesting figure in the case. His extortion attempt had been sophisticated enough to warrant continued attention. Investigators discovered that Lewis had a history of scams and fraud, including an incident in which he had been charged with the murder of and dismemberment of a man in Kansas City in 1978, though those charges were later dropped. His letter to Johnson & Johnson had been carefully crafted, showing an understanding of corporate operations and including details about the murders that hadn't been made public. In 1983, investigators also began exploring connections to copycat crimes that had emerged in the wake of the Chicago murders. There were numerous incidents of product tampering reported across the country, though fortunately most were hoaxes. However, in 1986, Diane Ellsroth of Yonkers, New York, died after taking cyanide-laced extra-strength Tylenol. This case shared many similarities with the Chicago murders, but investigators were never able to definitively link the two. The investigation took another interesting turn when authorities began looking into the possibility that the killer might have had inside knowledge of drug distribution systems. They examined records from drug wholesalers, distribution centers, and retail stores, trying to determine if someone along the supply chain might have had the opportunity to tamper with the products. This angle was particularly challenging because in 1982, tracking systems for pharmaceuticals were far less sophisticated than they are today. One of the more chilling aspects of the case that emerged during the investigation was the realization that the killer must have known their victims would be random and anonymous. Unlike most murders, where there's often some connection between killer and victim, the Tylenol murderer seemed to have no specific targets. This random selection of victims made the crimes particularly terrifying to the public and especially difficult to solve. The investigation also revealed that the contaminated bottles had been placed in specific locations that maximized their deadly potential. The stores where the tainted Tylenol was found were all in high-traffic areas, and the bottles had been placed on easily accessible shelves. This suggested the killer had carefully planned the distribution of the poisoned capsules to ensure they would be purchased and consumed. By 1984, the active investigation began to slow down, though it never completely stopped. The FBI and local law enforcement maintained a task force dedicated to the case, and new leads were still being followed. The case became one of the FBI's most studied unsolved crimes, with new agents training on its details and methodologies. The impact on the pharmaceutical industry continued to evolve. Beyond the immediate changes in packaging, the murders led to fundamental shifts in how medications were manufactured and distributed. The industry moved away from capsules that could be easily opened and towards solid caplets and tablets. Quality control measures were enhanced, and new tracking systems were implemented to better monitor the movement of products from manufacture to sale. The case also had a lasting effect on how law enforcement approached product tampering cases. New protocols were developed for handling contaminated consumer products, and specialized forensic techniques were created to detect tampering. The FBI established dedicated units to deal with product tampering threats, and new laboratory procedures were developed specifically for analyzing tampered pharmaceuticals. The psychological impact on the American public was profound and long-lasting. The murders shattered the implicit trust people had in over-the-counter medications. The idea that something as commonplace as a bottle of pain reliever could be turned into a deadly weapon created a new kind of anxiety about consumer safety. This led to a broader awareness of personal security and a heightened skepticism about product safety in general. In the years following the murders, numerous theories emerged about the killer's identity and motivation. Some investigators believed the perpetrator might have been a disgruntled employee somewhere in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Others theorized it might have been someone with a grudge against the healthcare system or modern medicine in general. The random nature of the victims suggested the killer's primary motive might have been to create widespread fear and chaos rather than target specific individuals. The investigation took an interesting turn in 1986 when FBI agents began re-examining an earlier suspect named Roger Arnold. While Arnold had been initially cleared, new information suggested he had detailed knowledge about cyanide and access to the chemical through his work. However, Arnold's death in 2008 closed this avenue of investigation before any conclusive evidence could be established. By the late 1980s, investigators had developed several key theories about the killer's background. Based on the sophisticated nature of the tampering and the chemical knowledge displayed, they believed the perpetrator likely had some form of technical education or practical experience in chemistry or pharmaceuticals. The methodical nature of the crime suggested someone with strong organizational skills and attention to detail. The FBI's analysis of the crime scenes revealed another interesting pattern. All of the stores where contaminated Tylenol was found were located along major transportation routes in the Chicago area. This suggested the killer was familiar with the local geography and had carefully planned their movements to minimize the risk of detection. The placement of the tainted bottles also indicated someone who understood retail operations. The bottles were positioned where they were likely to be purchased quickly. In 2009, the investigation received renewed attention when FBI agents conducted a search of the Cambridge, Massachusetts home of James Lewis, the man previously convicted of attempting to extort Johnson & Johnson. While Lewis had been ruled out as the actual killer in the 1980s, new forensic techniques had become available that prompted investigators to take another look at his possible involvement. The search included the collection of DNA evidence and documents, but no charges resulted from this new investigation. The same year, authorities also revealed they were investigating a second person of interest, but they refused to publicly identify this individual. This development sparked new interest in the case, and investigators began re-interviewing witnesses and re-examining evidence using modern forensic techniques. They were particularly interested in applying new DNA analysis methods to the bottles and capsules that had been preserved from the original crime scenes. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case for investigators was the knowledge that the killer had likely handled the Tylenol bottles and capsules extensively during the tampering process. However, in 1982, DNA testing was not available, and many of the forensic techniques used today didn't exist. While evidence from the original investigation had been carefully preserved, the passage of time and the limitations of earlier evidence collection methods made it difficult to extract useful DNA profiles. The investigation also revealed more details about the psychological impact on the survivors and families of victims. The random nature of the killings had created a unique form of trauma. Unlike many crime victims' families who could at least understand why their loved ones were targeted, these families had to grapple with the senselessness of their losses. Their loved ones had died simply because they had purchased what should have been a safe, common medication. The case continued to influence public policy and corporate practices well into the 21st century. The Tylenol murders led to the development of anti-tampering legislation in other countries, and the incident is still studied in law enforcement training programs worldwide. The case is often cited as the event that launched the modern era of product security and consumer protection. In 2012, Illinois authorities announced they were working with federal prosecutors to build a case against someone they believed was responsible for the murders. While they didn't publicly name the suspect, they indicated that new evidence and forensic techniques had provided promising leads. However, as of 2023, no charges have been filed, and the case remains officially unsolved. The impact on Johnson & Johnson's corporate culture was equally long-lasting. The company's response to the crisis became a defining moment in its history, and the principles established during the crisis, particularly the priority of public safety over corporate profits, became deeply embedded in its corporate values. The company continued to refine and enhance its safety protocols, often exceeding regulatory requirements. The case also had a lasting impact on how law enforcement agencies approach product tampering investigations. The lessons learned from the Tylenol murders led to the development of specialized response protocols and investigative techniques. The FBI established dedicated units for handling product tampering cases, and new forensic methods were developed specifically for analyzing tampered consumer products. The mystery of who committed the Chicago Tylenol murders has endured for over 4 decades, making it one of America's most infamous unsolved crimes. The case represents a unique intersection of multiple criminal elements: serial murder, product tampering, terrorism, and extortion. The killer's method was particularly sinister because it turned a trusted household product into a weapon and made every consumer a potential target. The investigation continues to this day, though at a much slower pace. Cold case detectives periodically review the evidence, hoping that advances in forensic science or new information might finally lead to a breakthrough. The case files, which now fill numerous boxes and hard drives, contain thousands of leads, interviews, and pieces of evidence that have been collected over the years. One particularly intriguing aspect of the case that investigators have continued to explore is the possibility that the killer had inside knowledge of the pharmaceutical industry. The way the tampered bottles were distributed suggested someone who understood how drugstores rotated their stock and how consumers typically selected products. This knowledge could have come from working in retail pharmacy, drug distribution, or the pharmaceutical industry itself. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of the American consumer market to terrorist acts. The ease with which the killer was able to contaminate a widely used product and create nationwide panic demonstrated how sophisticated security systems could be undermined by relatively simple means. This realization led to increased security measures throughout the consumer products industry, far beyond just pharmaceuticals. As investigators continued to probe the case through the 2010s, they began applying new forensic techniques to old evidence. One area of particular interest was the examination of the cyanide itself. Modern analytical methods allowed scientists to study the chemical composition of the poison in greater detail than was possible in 1982. They hoped to identify specific impurities or trace elements that might help narrow down the source of the cyanide. The investigation also benefited from advances in behavioral analysis. FBI profilers revisited the case with new psychological insights developed over the decades. They noted that the killer's methodical approach and apparent lack of personal connection to the victims fit patterns seen in other cases of domestic terrorism. The profile suggested someone who viewed their actions as a mission rather than personal vengeance. In 2016, law enforcement officials revealed they had been using advanced DNA testing methods on evidence preserved from the original crime scenes. While the results of these tests have never been made public, sources close to the investigation indicated that partial DNA profiles had been obtained from some of the tampered bottles. However, The degradation of evidence over time and the limitations of 1982 evidence collection methods presented significant challenges. The case took another interesting turn when investigators began exploring possible connections to other unsolved product tampering cases from the same era. They discovered several incidents across the United States that shared similarities with the Tylenol murders, though none reached the same scale or sophistication. These cases helped investigators better understand the broader pattern of copycat crimes and potential links to the original murders. One aspect that continued to intrigue investigators was the killer's knowledge of chemistry. The potassium cyanide used in the murders had been carefully measured to ensure lethal doses. This suggested someone with practical experience handling dangerous chemicals, possibly through work in industry or academia. Investigators revisited employment records from Chicago area companies that used cyanide in their operations, looking for potential connections. The investigation also revealed new details about the immediate aftermath of the crimes. Recently released documents showed that in the days following the first deaths, hundreds of people contacted hospitals and poison control centers, fearful they might have taken contaminated Tylenol. This panic highlighted how effectively the killer had undermined public confidence in everyday consumer products. Law enforcement officials also began taking a fresh look at James Lewis, the convicted extortionist. While Lewis had been ruled out as the actual killer, investigators were interested in whether he might have had knowledge of the crimes that he hadn't revealed. His letter to Johnson & Johnson had contained details that suggested inside knowledge, and investigators wondered if he might have been connected to the killer in some way. The case continued to influence public policy well into the 2020s. When new threats emerged, such as concerns about tampering with COVID-19 vaccines, officials drew upon lessons learned from the Tylenol murders to develop security protocols. The case became a blueprint for how to protect the pharmaceutical supply chain from malicious interference. Investigators also explored possible connections to the emergence of the dark web and underground chemical markets. While these resources weren't available in 1982, investigators wondered if communications or transactions related to the murders might have surfaced in these forums. This led to a new avenue of investigation, with agents monitoring online discussions for any mentions of the case that might contain non-public information. The human toll of the murders continued to resonate decades later. Survivors and family members of victims formed support groups and advocated for stronger consumer protection laws. Their stories served as powerful reminders of the real human cost behind what many viewed as simply a fascinating unsolved mystery. By 2023, the case had generated over 500,000 pages of documents, thousands of interviews, and countless leads. While the active investigation had slowed, it never completely stopped. Cold case detectives continued to receive tips and follow up on new leads, hoping that someone might finally come forward with the crucial piece of information needed to solve the case. The Tylenol murders remained a source of both professional frustration and fascination for law enforcement. The killer had managed to commit multiple murders without leaving enough evidence for prosecution, despite an investigation that involved thousands of law enforcement officers and millions of dollars in resources. The case served as a humbling reminder that some crimes, despite the best efforts of investigators and the most advanced forensic techniques, might never be solved. The legacy of the Tylenol murders extends far beyond the immediate investigation. The case fundamentally changed how Americans think about product safety and corporate responsibility. It led to reforms that have undoubtedly saved countless lives, even as the person responsible for prompting these changes through their deadly actions remains unidentified. The investigation continues, but time is running out to bring the killer to justice, as potential suspects age or pass away, and physical evidence deteriorates further. The passage of time has presented unique challenges for investigators working the Tylenol case. By 2023, many of the original investigators had retired or passed away, taking with them valuable institutional knowledge about the case. However, their meticulous documentation has allowed new generations of detectives to continue the pursuit of justice. Recent years have seen investigators exploring the possibility that the killer might have been involved in other unsolved crimes from the same era. They've been particularly interested in cases involving chemical poisoning or product tampering that occurred in the Midwest during the early 1980s. While no definitive connections have been established, several cases have shown intriguing similarities in methodology and chemical knowledge. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has continued to refine their profile of the killer. They now believe the perpetrator would have been in their late 20s to early 40s at the time of the murders, placing them in their 60s or 70s today if still alive. The profile suggests someone who was highly intelligent, detail-oriented, and potentially worked in a field requiring precision and chemical knowledge. Modern analysis of the crime has also focused on the killer's choice of locations. Using advanced geographical profiling techniques, investigators have determined that the pattern of store locations where tainted bottles were placed wasn't as random as initially thought. The distribution suggested someone who lived or worked in the northwest suburbs of Chicago and was familiar with local shopping patterns. In 2022, investigators revealed they had been using artificial intelligence algorithms to analyze decades of tips, witness statements, and suspect interviews. This technology has helped identify patterns and connections that might have been missed by human investigators. The AI analysis has also helped prioritize which cold case leads deserve renewed attention. The case has taken on new relevance in the age of bioterrorism and global pandemics. Security experts often cite the Tylenol murders when discussing vulnerabilities in the pharmaceutical supply chain. The lessons learned from this case have influenced how authorities approach threats to public health infrastructure, particularly regarding the security of vaccines and medical supplies. Recent interviews with surviving family members have revealed the ongoing impact of these crimes. Many have expressed frustration that despite technological advances and decades of investigation, the killer has never been brought to justice. However, they've also spoken about how their advocacy for consumer safety has helped them find meaning in their personal tragedies. The investigation has also benefited from advances in forensic psychology. Modern analysts have suggested that the killer's methodology, using a trusted consumer product as a weapon, indicates someone who wanted to attack the foundations of consumer trust in American society. This perspective has led investigators to explore new angles involving anti-corporate or anti-establishment groups active in the early 1980s. As the case approaches its fifth decade, investigators face a race against time. Physical evidence, though carefully preserved, continues to degrade. Witnesses' memories fade, and potential suspects age or die. However, the commitment to solving this case remains strong, with law enforcement agencies maintaining that the Tylenol murders represent unfinished business in American criminal justice. The case continues to be actively investigated by a joint task force of FBI agents and local law enforcement officers. They regularly review new tips and leads, apply new forensic techniques to preserved evidence, and interview persons of interest. While the passage of time has made their task more difficult, it has also brought new tools and perspectives to the investigation. The Tylenol murders remain one of America's most significant unsolved crimes, not just because of their deadly impact, but because they fundamentally changed how we as a society think about consumer safety and corporate responsibility. The case serves as both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for positive change, even as the identity of the person responsible remains hidden in the shadows of history.